Hey guys, tonight let's slow everything down. Dim the lights a little, put the phone face down, maybe imagine an old radio humming softly in the background. Because tonight, we're drifting back to a time when America had just finished throwing the loudest, flashiest party it had ever known, and was about to realize the music had stopped, the lights were off, and nobody had any money left for the cab home. So yeah, tonight we begin with the Great Depression. Not the dramatic version with sudden screams and explosions, but the real one, the quiet one, the slow, grinding realization that everything was broken and no one quite knew how to fix it. Now, before everything collapsed, America in the 1920s was feeling fantastic, almost suspiciously fantastic. This was the decade of jazz, cheap credit, fast cars, and the unshakable belief that things would only ever go up. Stocks went up, profits went up, confidence went way, way up. Everyone was rich, or at least everyone felt rich, which, as history gently reminds us, is not the same thing. People who had never owned stocks before suddenly became financial geniuses overnight. Your barber had stock tips. Your neighbor had stock tips. Your neighbor's dog probably had stock tips. And if you didn't have the money to invest, that was fine. You could just borrow it. Because why not double down? Banks were happy to lend, brokers were thrilled to help, and margin buying, essentially borrowing most of the money to buy stocks, was completely normal, perfectly reasonable. Nothing could go wrong. America had also decided it had mastered capitalism. Recessions, old news. Panics, a thing of the past. This was the modern economy now, controlled, scientific, tamed. Which is usually when history clears its throat. Behind all the optimism, there were cracks forming. Factories were producing more goods than people could realistically buy. Farmers were already struggling, drowning in debt after years of overproduction. Wages weren't rising nearly as fast as profits. But none of that mattered because Wall Street was soaring, and as long as Wall Street was happy, everyone assumed everything else would sort itself out eventually. Spoiler, it did not. By October 1929, the stock market started doing something deeply unsettling. It wobbled. Then it dipped. Then people began to panic. And panic, it turns out, spreads faster than optimism ever did. On Black Thursday, October 24th, investors started selling. On Black Monday, they sold more. On Black Tuesday, October 29th, the bottom fell out completely. Millions of shares were dumped. Prices collapsed. Fortunes vanished in hours. And here's the thing that often gets missed. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression all by itself. It was more like kicking out the last support beam from a house that was already leaning. Still, the psychological shock was enormous. Trust evaporated, confidence disappeared, and once people stop believing in the system tends to stop working. Banks began to fail. Not all at once, just one by one, slow enough to be terrifying. People lined up outside banks trying to withdraw their savings. Most banks didn't have that cash on hand because they'd loaned it out or invested it or lost it. When a bank failed, deposits were simply gone. No insurance, no safety net, just gone. Entire life savings vanished overnight, and with them went the ability to buy food, pay rent, or keep businesses afloat. Companies started cutting jobs, then cutting hours, then shutting down entirely. Unemployment crept up, 10%, 15%. Eventually, nearly 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. And this wasn't the modern version of unemployment. There were no benefits, no government checks quietly arriving in the mail. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. Simple, brutal, very efficient in the worst possible way. Bread lines formed in cities, long, quiet lines of men in worn coats waiting patiently for soup and bread. Men who had been clerks, factory workers, managers, accountants, men who had once felt completely secure. Families lost their homes. Evictions became routine. Entire neighborhoods of shacks called Hoovervilles, because subtlety was dead, sprung up on the edges of cities. Which brings us gently and without enthusiasm to the man in charge, President Herbert Hoover. Now, Hoover wasn't a villain. History sometimes paints him as a heartless symbol of inaction, but reality is softer and sadder. He genuinely believed in self-reliance, in private charity, in the idea that government stepping in too much would somehow make things worse. And in normal times, that philosophy had worked for him. He'd been a wildly successful engineer, a humanitarian who had organized food relief during World War I, a living example of competence. Unfortunately, the Great Depression did not care about his resume. Hoover believed the economy would correct itself, that recovery was just around the corner. He said so publicly, repeatedly, which, as the months dragged on and conditions worsened, started to sound less like reassurance and more like denial. Behind the scenes, Hoover did try some interventions. He encouraged businesses not to cut wages. He supported public works projects. He helped create institutions to stabilize banks. But it wasn't enough. And worse, it wasn't fast. To millions of Americans, Hoover became the face of failure. His name was attached to soup kitchens, shantytowns, and empty pockets, a grim kind of branding exercise. Meanwhile, farmers were being hit especially hard. Crop prices collapsed, debt piled up, foreclosures swept across rural America. In the Midwest, dust storms began to roll in. Topsoil, stripped by years of overfarming, lifted into the air and drifted across entire states. The sky would turn dark at noon. Dust settled into houses, lungs, food. The land itself seemed exhausted, and honestly, so was everyone living on it. By the early 1930s, America was stuck in a feedback loop of misery. People didn't spend because they had no money. Businesses failed because people didn't spend. Banks collapsed because businesses failed. And people saved whatever money they had left because they no longer trusted banks. Everything slowed, then stopped. And the most unsettling part was how quiet it all felt. No single dramatic moment, no obvious villain, just years of waiting. Waiting for jobs, waiting for relief, waiting for something, anything to change. Children grew up hungry, families crowded together in shrinking spaces. Pride dissolved slowly, replaced by survival. And as the decade turned, Americans began to look for a different kind of leadership. Someone who didn't promise that everything was already fine. Someone who admitted things were bad, and then talked about doing something anyway. But we'll drift toward that shift later. For now, stay here, in the early years, in the stillness. The party was over, the bill had arrived, and America was staring at it in silence, trying to figure out how it had all gone so wrong. Let's ease forward from here next time, into desperation, adaptation, and the slow search for hope.
All right, let's settle back in. Nothing sudden is going to happen. That's kind of the point. By 1930, America wasn't shocked anymore. Shock had worn off. What replaced it was something slower and heavier. Endurance. People stopped asking when things would get better. They started asking how long they could hold on. Jobs kept disappearing. Factories that had once run day and night now stood silent, windows dusty, machines perfectly still. A strange calm settled over industrial towns. Not peace, just absence. Men still woke up early out of habit, put on coats that no longer went to workplaces. They walked anyway, sometimes just to walk, sometimes to look busy, sometimes to avoid sitting at home feeling useless. And if you were lucky enough to still have a job, you clung to it quietly. No complaints, no demands. You showed up early and left late, grateful to be exploited just enough to survive. Banks, meanwhile, continued their slow collapse. Every failure created more fear. Every fear created more withdrawals. Every withdrawal made the next failure more likely. It was like watching dominoes fall in extreme slow motion. You knew how it would end, you just couldn't stop it. The government, for its part, still hesitated. The idea of large-scale federal aid felt radical, suspicious, un-American, some said. Relief, it was believed, should come from local communities, from churches, from neighbors, from private charities already stretched to the breaking point. And yes, people helped each other. They shared food, they took in relatives, they patched clothes until fabric simply ran out of dignity. But charity has limits, and hunger doesn't care about ideology. By 1931, unemployment was no longer just a statistic, it was visible everywhere. Men sleeping on park benches, teenagers hopping freight trains, drifting from town to town in search of work that didn't exist. These young wanderers became known as hobos. They developed their own quiet culture. Symbols scratched onto fences, unspoken rules, a moving population of the unemployed, floating across the country like human tumbleweeds. Families tried to stay intact, but the strain was relentless. Arguments over money became arguments over existence. Children noticed more than adults wanted to admit. A generation was growing up learning that security was temporary, that comfort could vanish, that adults didn't always have answers. President Hoover remained publicly calm. Privately, he was exhausted. He still believed recovery would come if the government didn't interfere too much. He worried that direct aid would destroy initiative, that Americans would lose their moral backbone if helped too openly. History would later argue about this endlessly, but at the time, people weren't debating philosophy, they were debating whether to skip meals. In 1932, desperation finally boiled over in a very specific way. Enter the bonus army. During World War I, soldiers had been promised a bonus, a sort of delayed thank you payment. The problem was it wasn't scheduled to be paid until 1945, which felt very far away when you couldn't afford dinner. So, tens of thousands of veterans and their families marched on Washington, D.C. They camped out, built makeshift shelters, waited politely. They weren't violent, they weren't revolutionary, they just wanted their money early. And for a moment, it felt like the nation was holding its breath. Congress debated, argued, ultimately said no. Some veterans left, many stayed. Hoover, fearing unrest, ordered them removed. What followed was not subtle. Federal troops moved in, camps were burned, families fled. The image of soldiers driving out former soldiers was devastating. It didn't matter how complex the reasoning was behind the scenes. What people saw was the government using force against men who had once worn its uniform. Public opinion hardened. Sympathy shifted. Hope drained further. By this point, Hoover's presidency was effectively over, even if the election hadn't happened yet. Americans weren't just looking for policies anymore. They were looking for tone, for reassurance that someone, somewhere understood how bad things felt. Enter a new voice on the horizon. Calm, confident, warm. A man who spoke in complete sentences and made promises that sounded doable. Franklin Roosevelt wasn't president yet, but he was everywhere. He talked about action, about experimentation, about the idea that trying something was better than trying nothing perfectly. And most importantly, he spoke to people like adults, struggling adults, not theoretical ones. As the 1932 election approached, the contrast was stark. Hoover offered caution, Roosevelt offered motion. When Roosevelt won in a landslide, it wasn't just a political shift, it was emotional. People didn't expect miracles, they expected effort. But before anything could be fixed, things had one more low point to reach. In the final months of Hoover's presidency, the banking system teetered on total collapse. States began closing banks entirely to prevent runs. Money became something people hid, not spent. By the time Roosevelt was sworn in, America was exhausted. Not panicked, not screaming, just very, very tired. And in that quiet exhaustion, the stage was set for something new, something unprecedented, something that would reshape how Americans thought about government, responsibility, and survival itself. But we'll ease into that gently. No rush. History is going nowhere. Let's float onward next, into fireside chats, bold experiments, and the slow, cautious rebuilding of trust.
All right, let's exhale a little. By March of 1933, America wasn't looking for perfection anymore. It was looking for movement, any movement at all. The country had been frozen in place for years, and when Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office, what he inherited wasn't just an economic disaster, it was a psychological one. Banks were failing daily. Some states had already shut their entire banking systems down. People hoarded cash in mattresses, jars, books. Trust had evaporated so thoroughly that money itself felt suspicious. And Roosevelt knew something crucial. Before fixing the economy, he had to calm the fear. So one of the first things he did was pause everything. A national bank holiday. No banks open, no withdrawals, just a temporary stop. Which sounds terrifying, and somehow worked. Roosevelt went on the radio, spoke directly to Americans in what became known as fireside chats. His voice was steady, plain, unhurried. He explained what was happening in simple language, no jargon, no panic. And people listened, because for the first time in years, someone was talking to them, not at them. When banks reopened, people didn't rush to withdraw their money. They brought it back. It wasn't magic, it was trust. Fragile, cautious trust. From there came the New Deal. Not a single plan, but a flood of them. Programs appeared rapidly, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradictory, sometimes clearly improvised. And Roosevelt was fine with that. His philosophy was simple. Try something. If it works, keep it. If it doesn't, try something else. This was deeply unsettling to people who preferred tidy systems, but desperation had made America flexible. The government hired people directly, not glamorous jobs, but jobs. Building roads, bridges, dams, parks. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent young men into forests and fields. They planted trees, fought erosion, sent money home to families who desperately needed it. The Works Progress Administration put artists, writers, and musicians to work, because even in collapse, culture mattered. For the first time, the federal government became a visible presence in everyday survival. And while critics called it dangerous or socialist or reckless, most people just called it food. Social Security followed, old age pensions, unemployment insurance. The idea that society might collectively care for its weakest members was no longer theoretical, it was policy. Not everyone benefited equally, Minorities were often excluded or sidelined. Women were frequently pushed aside. The New Deal wasn't fair, but it was something. And something was enough to change the direction of the drift. The economy did improve. Slowly, unevenly. Unemployment fell but never vanished. Confidence returned in patches. Some industries recovered faster than others. And then, just to keep things interesting, there was a relapse. In 1937, the economy dipped again. Jobs disappeared. Production slowed. It was a reminder that recovery wasn't a straight line, that trauma lingers. But this time, the country didn't collapse inward. The system bent, adjusted, continued. By the late 1930s, the Great Depression had reshaped America in permanent ways. People distrusted easy optimism now. They saved more, spent cautiously, remembered scarcity even when times improved. Children who grew up during the Depression carried its lessons forever. Waste felt sinful. Security felt temporary. Government, too, had changed. The idea that it should remain distant during catastrophe no longer held. Whether people liked it or not, the relationship between citizens and the state had been rewritten. And yet, it's important to say this gently. The Great Depression didn't truly end because of brilliant policy alone. It ended because the world changed. As the late 1930s faded into the 1940s, global tensions rose. Factories restarted. Production surged. War, grimly, demanded everything the economy had been unable to generate before. The Depression didn't so much heal as it was overtaken. But its scars remained. People remembered standing in bread lines, losing homes, watching parents struggle quietly. They remembered how thin civilization could feel, how quickly comfort could disappear. And those memories shaped politics, economics, and culture for generations. So when we talk about the Great Depression, we're not really talking about numbers or charts or markets. We're talking about waiting, about uncertainty, about long years where nothing happened and that nothing felt unbearable. A collapse without explosions, a tragedy without a clear villain, just millions of ordinary lives paused, stretched thin, and slowly reshaped. And that's where we'll let things rest tonight. Not with a triumphant ending, not a neat resolution, just with the quiet understanding that America endured, changed, and carried the memory forward. So take a breath, let the radio fade out, and drift off knowing that history, like people, often survives not by brilliance, but by stubborn persistence. Good night.